This story began with a scary moment. When in the middle of the dark night in the walls of the imperial temple, an exhausted woman was sitting on the floor, and a young man was slowly approaching her with a sword in his hands, followed by a trail of blood from the lifeless body he left behind. The young man stopped in front of the horrified woman and swung his sword, shaking off the remaining blood from it. With eyes filled with fear, the woman looked at the boy and asked why he was doing all this. With a predatory smile and a crazy look, the young man replied that it was all because she, his mother, was still alive. And then the boy corrected himself and added that it is more correct to say not the mother, but the former empress. After these words, without a second's hesitation, the young man brought his sword over the woman's head. She narrowed her eyes. Another moment, and the lifeless body of the empress fell on the cold floor of the temple. The boy immediately turned around and wanted to leave, but could not, and returned to his mother's body again. Meanwhile, the woman's soul left the body. She looked at herself and realized that she was dead. While the soul hovered near the body, the young man stood for a few minutes and silently looked at the bloody corpse. And the woman thought about the fact that she and this young man were separated by an entire abyss of 15 years. And how much pain did this unfortunate child have to endure in complete solitude? Coming out from behind the clouds, the moon illuminated the killer's face. He was a very young boy, a real handsome man, who had grey hair that shimmered silver in the moonlight, and bitter tears flowed from deep red eyes. Seeing her son shed tears on her body, the woman felt incredibly sorry for him, her eyes also filled with tears. Grief and despair gripped the mother, and she screamed with all her might for Yuri to forgive her. Suddenly, the woman's soul shone and gradually began to disappear. She was frightened and asked the heavens to wait. The empress always asked to wait because she could not just take it and disappear. Due to the fact that she tried to escape from reality, she inadvertently left an incurable deep wound in Yuri's heart. The woman understood that she had to fix everything, that she cannot leave the young man in such a state. Mother was ready for everything. Therefore, she began to pray to all the saints to give her one more chance to fix everything. A moment later, the woman, shouting Yuri's name in despair, suddenly came to her senses in a large chair. She opened her eyes wide and was quite surprised when she saw that she was in some room, and it was broad daylight outside. How warm rays of the sun flooded the rooms, and a fresh breeze swayed the curtains on the windows. The woman looked around in confusion and could not understand where she was and what had happened. Here she noticed a diary on the table, the pages of which rustled from the wind. The woman was stunned when she saw a date from 10 years ago in the diary. Couldn't that mean she went back in time? Having calmed down a little and put things in order in her head, she was no longer a woman, but a beautiful girl with silver hair and blue eyes, filled with inspiration and confidence. The next moment she tossed the diary and ran out of the room, so fast that the shawl flew off her shoulders. The fact was that once she had to break up with Yuri right after giving birth. Being the daughter of a baron, she had to face the harsh looks of those around her every day and feel rejected by everyone else. And her husband, the emperor, was constantly on military trips, so he rarely visited the imperial palace. That is why the birth of Yuri became her only hope for a happy life. However, the reality was different. Immediately after the birth of his son, the emperor visited the empress's chambers. He thanked his tired wife for her hard work. And then he stated in a cold voice that she had done everything that was required of her. The young mother could not believe her ears. She looked puzzled at the emperor, who approached the head maid and started talking to her about something. Leaving the room, the man only added to the maid that he was leaving everything else to the employee of the education sector. The empress wanted to stop him, but no one paid attention to her. The emperor went out in silence, only slamming the door loudly. The girl was shocked. She was horrified, scared, and did not know what to do. Then the girl looked at her little son. Then sadness, regret, and despair took over her heart. The girl perfectly understood her powerlessness. She took the child in her arms and hugged her tightly. Here, the head maid came to the bed of the empress, who in a cold and stern voice asked the girl to give her the child. The gaze of the woman and the other maids radiated indifference and contempt towards her. Without waiting for an answer, the maid sharply bent down and extended her little hands to the child. The frightened girl, with tears in her eyes, hugged her son even tighter and shouted that they should not take him away from her, that she herself will raise this child and will do everything to make him happy. But the maid only contemptuously asked, "What can a girl give this child?" In response to this, the empress angrily shouted that she was, after all, his own mother. To which the woman pointed out in an indifferent voice that this is precisely why, undoubtedly, the girl perfectly coped with the duty of giving birth to an heir. But didn't His Majesty the Emperor tell the girl that she had already done everything that was required of her? The girl had nothing to answer the maid. How then the little prince woke up and, clenching his little fists, burst into tears. Tearing the child from the hands of the girl, the maid did not pay any attention to her screams, tears, and despair. The woman only noted that this was not a request from someone from outside, and the order of His Majesty the Emperor, and the chief maid left the Empress's chambers with the child in her arms. The maids who remained in the rooms began to mock and whisper loudly among themselves that the Emperor's wife from the Baron's family was not even capable of taking responsibility for the care of the Crown Prince. At that moment, the girl could only painfully realize how powerless she was in this whole situation. Since then, she no longer had the right to see Yuri, except for some official events or meetings. This child was destined to grow up to be the Crown Prince, not to have anything in common with her. According to this scenario, the girl's first life ended with her death at the hands of her own son, but she promised herself that everything would be different in this life. After running through the corridors of the palace, the girl went down to another part of the building and began to bang on the large oak doors with all her might. She shouted to immediately release Yuri. The servants standing at the door tried to calm the girl down. They asked Her Majesty to stop. Moreover, they have already told her many times that he will not be released under any conditions. Waving off the servants, the girl said that she would not stop for anything and demanded to take her hands away. Then she looked sternly at one of the servants and pointed out in a firm voice that the Empress wanted to meet the Crown Prince, so no one had the right to forbid her. The servants looked at each other embarrassed and could not argue with the Empress, so one of them took out the key and unlocked the lock. Having opened the heavy door, the servants bowed to the Empress and let her in. The girl did not have time to take even a couple of steps as she looked ahead and froze. A small boy looked from around the corner of the corridor. He had the same silver hair as hers and big red eyes. Yuri looked at his mother, who came so unexpectedly, with surprise on his face. For several minutes they stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at each other. Yuri could not believe that his mother had come. The boy looked fascinated at the beautiful and stately Empress, who so confidently entered his part of the palace. The next moment, the mother rushed to hug her son tightly, shouting his name. Yuri was amazed by such an emotional meeting, and the servants who were watching everything were also a little confused. Surprised, Yuri asked the Empress in an uncertain voice if something had happened to her. The boy raised his eyes and saw how sadly his mother looked at him with her blue eyes. Then she once again hugged him tenderly and replied that she just really wanted to meet him, that's all. About herself, the girl thought that in her past life, the conversation of a person of her status with the Crown Prince was considered an insult to the imperial family. That's what everyone said. That's how, deep down, the girl was afraid of judgment from those around her. And yes, she accepted this fact and agreed to live separately from her son. But now the girl understood everything. Her consent to those conversations and other people's opinions turned out to be a huge mistake. Therefore, this time she will not give up just like that and will do everything possible to prevent the past from happening again. Hugging her son, the girl gently said that he was her sweet Yuri. Hearing this, the boy was even more surprised, and then he pressed closer to his mother and hugged her too, because he also missed her very much. Feeling her son's embrace in return, the girl told herself that no matter who or what he told her, she would definitely make Yuri happy. Still continuing to hug her son, the girl heard how Yuri managed to pronounce in a barely quiet voice, "Mother." The Empress quickly let him go and apologized because she was so moved that she almost suffocated him in her arms. But Yuri said that this is not the point. Mother asked what happened. With a gloomy expression on his face and a sad voice, the boy asked why she never answered his letter. The girl looked at Yuri in surprise and asked what letter he was talking about. But suddenly horror appeared on the son's face. The boy became even more upset. Frightened by such a reaction, the mother tried to explain that she had not received any letter. But they were interrupted. Two maids appeared in the corridor. The younger maid grabbed the Crown Prince and dragged him back, and the older woman rudely addressed Empress Daria and asked her to leave immediately. The younger maid informed Yuri that Miss Adelaide, his main tutor, would be back soon. Until then, he needs to wait for her in his room. The boy agreed. And when the maid led him to the room, he looked at his mother with indescribable sadness in his eyes. Daria resisted when the senior maid began to lead her out of the corridor, but she lost strength. Therefore, she only watched as her little son was taken away from her again and locked behind a heavy oak door. When the door closed, the senior maid sighed unhappily and noted that until yesterday the crown prince was sitting quietly, peacefully in his room, and today he had to see her. At the same time, the woman also chirped in annoyance. Daria's blood was boiling with anger. She looked at the woman with a wolf's gaze and remained silent. Then the empress said that Yuri said that he had sent her a letter. She asked the maid where this letter was and why it did not reach her. To which the woman replied that she had no idea what she was talking about. Filled with anger, Daria sternly looked the maid straight in the eyes and said in a firm voice that if she does not want to be kicked out of this palace, then let her bring those letters to her immediately. And then she also shouted for the maid to move at the pace of the waltz. The frightened woman did not expect this and ran to carry out the order. The empress was led into the guest room, where she sat waiting by the window. After a few minutes, the maids with boxes in their hands started to bustle around. Daria began to get even more angry when she saw how many boxes with letters the maids had carried. She took turns opening and reading the letters. There were many letters that Yuri sent as soon as he learned to write. There were drawings and the first poems that the child wrote for his mother. From these letters, one could see how beautiful and clear his calligraphy became over the years. In his letters, the boy was constantly interested in how his mother was doing. He wrote that he wanted very much to meet her, but since he did not receive an answer from her, he began to think that his mother did not love him at all, and he hoped that it was not so. The little prince waited impatiently for her answer. Tears began to drip on the letters that Daria was just reading. She burst into tears, realizing how much her son loved her. That all her previous life she had been standing in front of those closed, heavy oak doors, and she didn't even try to open them. But as it turned out, she was not the only one suffering. The little boy on this side of the door was also very sad. While Daria shed tears as she read the letters, the maids who had then taken Yuri and led her outside the crown prince's palace, and who had brought the boxes of letters, stood aside and watched the empress. Seeing the girls suffering, they felt ashamed of their actions. They both bowed their heads. Then the head maid turned to Her Majesty and said that they were really very sorry. Daria looked at them with displeasure and asked who ordered them to do that. The maid hesitated to answer. Wiping away her tears, the empress firmly said with a stern look that it was enough, that the maids would still be punished after she found out who did it. Getting up, the empress ordered the maids to take all these letters to her room and went out. The girl walked down a long corridor and thought that in order to start living with Yuri, she first needed to convince that man, the one whose last words were that she had done whatever was necessary. Since then, they did not speak at all with the emperor. Daria walked through the palace to another wing. She was holding a bunch of Yuri's letters in her hands because now they were her precious treasure. Inspired by this cute treasure, the girl was full of confidence and determination. Then she turned to the butler who was standing in front of the door of His Majesty, the Emperor's office. At first the butler was surprised when he noticed the Empress, and then kindly opened the door for her, and the girl confidently entered the office, where the Emperor of the Ilvarian Empire was sitting at the table. A young man with dark hair and deep red eyes. It was he who was Daria's best friend, and also Yuri's father. Alexander Klaus, the Emperor of the Ilvarian Empire, was surprised by the unexpected visit of Her Majesty. Having bowed, Daria bowed and properly greeted His Majesty. She also noted that it had been a long time since their last meeting. Looking closely at the girl, the Emperor directly asked if something had happened in the palace. The Empress looked up and answered with excitement in her voice that she did, and that was exactly what she wanted to talk to him about. Then Alexander put the documents aside and calmly got up from the table. He sat down on the sofa in silence. Daria looked puzzled at the butler, who with a smile pointed to another sofa, which was standing at the table opposite. A few minutes later, the butler brought tea and treats. While the servant was pouring the tea, the Empress spoke briefly about the door that could not be opened and asked if His Highness understood what she was talking about. Then Alexander glanced at the butler, who was calmly continuing to pour tea, and Daria asked if the Emperor could give her permission to freely enter that door. She thought about herself that that door was a thick barrier that clearly separated her and Yuri's life. The door that could not be opened. You had to be a member of the education department to get in the door, and the guards were given clear instructions about who was allowed in and who was not. In her past life, Daria never managed to go for them. But if somehow she manages to get permission from His Highness, then no one will have the right to prevent her from going there. The Empress bowed her head once more and asked His Majesty for permission, as she wanted to get rid of all the restrictive lines between her and Yuri. Alexander kept looking at the girl in silence, but his eyes began to grow, and his aura suddenly became ominous. Daria was nervous because her husband did not react in any way. She started clutching Yuri's letters more and more tightly, which she hadn't let go of all this time. Then the girl put the letters on the table in front of the emperor and said that she had found several letters that Yuri had written for her. That there were a lot of them, and she received them very recently. Then she looked into Alexander's eyes with a burning look and added in a stern tone that it seemed that for some reason the letters were locked in the box. It was obvious to Daria that someone had ordered that these letters should not reach her. And since someone decided to play with the feelings of her son, Yuri, she will not forgive them for anything. Then the girl lowered her eyes and said that she was the real mother of the crown prince, and she was sad just by the thought that he had to grow up without a mother's love. Therefore, starting from this moment, she wants to spend as much time as possible with Yuri. But Alexander remained silent and only looked intently at the Empress. From the essence of any reaction, Daria began to simply freak out. Clenching her fists, which began to shake with anger, the Empress announced that she would not leave until he gave her permission, and then angrily added that if they didn't try, they wouldn't be able to remove her blood from the boy. That she connects them. Then, holding her breath, Daria kept looking at Alexander, waiting for an answer. Finally, the Emperor reacted. He said she could do whatever she wanted. The girl asked if he really gives her permission, to which the man replied that she had said herself that she would not go until she had permission, so what was the problem? Barely holding back tears, happy Daria bowed and thanked His Majesty. But when the Empress said goodbye to the Emperor and was going to leave, as she had promised, he suddenly stopped her. The man said he would give his permission, but with some conditions. Daria asked under what conditions. Then Alexander got up and approached the girl. He took out and showed her a beautiful, thin, golden key dangling from his finger. The Emperor noted that this is the key to that door, so he wants her to come and take it herself. At first glance, Daria did not like this condition. She did not understand what Alexander was up to, but it was for Yuri's sake. The girl approached His Majesty and held out her hand to him. The man calmly lowered the key into her palm. When the key was in the hands of the Empress, she thanked the Emperor once more, bowed low, and left the office. And Alexander stood for a few more seconds and looked at his hand, which so easily handed over the girl's keys. Daria herself at the same moment immediately went to the heavy oak door, which could not be opened. The servants guarding them, seeing the Empress, already blocked her way. Radiant with joy, the girl hastened to inform the servants that she had received permission from His Majesty and presented them with the key. After that, she asked them to open the door. The guards looked at each other in confusion again, but they did not argue with the Empress, but opened the door for her. Daria thought that finally, the door that could not be opened had opened, and now she would be able to change the future. The girl ran all over the part of the palace that belonged to the crown prince, but could not find Yuri anywhere. She did not understand where he could have disappeared. And when she asked the servants what had happened on her way, they all avoided the answer, as if they did not know anything at all. And finally, she found her son in the garden. The boy sat on the path and looked at the flowers. Then Daria opened one of Yuri's letters. The boy wrote in it that a girl told him that she liked flowers. Then he wondered what flowers his mother likes, and he offered to somehow collect them together. Then the Empress joyfully called out to Yuri. The boy turned in surprise when he heard her voice. He was shocked when he saw his mother, who was able to pass through that door again, and she was sitting next to him with a happy smile. Then the boy turned his attention to the letter that the Empress was holding. With sadness in her eyes, the girl asked Yuri for forgiveness for being so late. That she had time to read only a few letters, but from now on she would read one letter after another until they were finished, and she would definitely answer each one. Hearing this, the boy sank down and hid his eyes. He quietly bit his lip so that his mother would not see. Then Daria suggested Yuri to start right now. Pointing to the letter, she noted that he wrote about flowers in it. And I asked my son what kind of flowers he was trying to draw there. But the boy was silent. Suddenly, the prince was struck by lightning and he jumped up sharply, scaring his mother. At first, Yuri wanted to say something, but he couldn't. He just apologized and ran away. Daria tried to stop him, asked him to wait and stay, but in vain, the boy ran away. The upset girl remained sitting on the floor among the flowers, holding the children's letter in her hands. The next morning, the dejected empress sat in her room and sighed heavily. She understood that yesterday she was so happy to meet Yuri that she accidentally confused him and he ran away. The girl sat at the table and continued to read letters written by Yuri. She noted with sadness that he had written so much thinking about her. Daria also thought that if she hadn't been able to live her life again, she might never have known about it. The girl sighed heavily again and told herself that she should be more careful. And remembering an unpleasant incident from her childhood, she thought that children are much more sensitive than their parents think. Daria shook her head to drive away painful memories and unpleasant thoughts. She got up and went to the window. Opening the curtains, the girl mentally noted to herself that she could not hurt the child's feelings simply by presenting him from this distant place. Then the empress loudly announced that from today she would begin to get to know her Yuri better. And Daria was already standing in front of the door of the emperor's office. She thought to herself that she had been full of enthusiasm since the morning, but now, before every meeting with Yuri, she needs to look at His Majesty. But just as the girl raised her hand to knock on the office door, she heard a cold voice behind her, which announced that His Majesty was not there, that he went to the territory of Beltrasia to check the troops that were there. And then an unpleasant voice scathingly pointed out that the wife knows this very well. The blood in Daria's veins immediately boiled. She was perfectly familiar with this haughty tone. She looked around and saw Yuri's head teacher in the corridor accompanied by a pair of maids, Miss Adelaide. She was His Highness's aunt and was the woman who took Yuri away from the girl immediately after his birth. Daria didn't even want to see this woman, so she turned around and said that in that case she would come back here next time and left. But Miss Adelaide told the girl that if she needed a key to that door, she could open it for her. Daria looked at the woman with surprise and suspicion. After all, before the tutor did not let her approach the crown prince even a step, so what happened to her now? The girl watched as Adelaide handed over the key to the maid and then began to write some kind of note. She kept trying to understand what the woman was up to. When the teacher finished writing, she handed the paper to the empress. Smiling, the woman said that the girl needs to show this permit to the guards at the door and then she can enter. Daria hesitated, but in the absence of the emperor, she needed this permission. Then the girl thanked and reached for the paper. But just as she wanted to take him, Adelaide let go of the permission. And when he fell to the ground, the woman defiantly began to trample him. She snarled coldly that the empress had no need to interfere in the upbringing of the crown prince. That there is a tradition in the imperial family, according to which children receive education from relatives on the father's side. And then Adelaide wondered if the girl had forgotten what His Majesty had told her that day. He transfers everything else to an employee of the education sector. Then the woman mockingly pointed out that the girl should not tell her that she had forgotten about it. Daria was furious. Her fists were shaking with anger. But so far she had nothing to say in response to the arrogant teacher. She just silently passed by, ignoring the woman's words. The empress's lack of reaction annoyed Adelaide. When she was leaving with the maids, she asked them to watch their actions and not do anything superfluous. Picking up the dirty and crumpled permit, Daria understood that Miss Adelaide had enormous power in this palace. Therefore, even for Yuri's sake, going against her in this situation is not the best idea. Then the girl thought that in order to get to know Yuri better, she doesn't have to stay close to him, because you can just watch. So Daria began to secretly spy on her son. It's behind his fencing training, peering through the lattice. It is for his troublesome studies in the library, peeking out from behind the shelves with books. Then, at his usual lunch in the dining room under the supervision of the maids, peering through the window from the outside. While having dinner, Yuri practiced using cutlery and accidentally dropped half of a tomato, which escaped from his plate onto the floor. One of the maids quickly came over and cleaned up the food from the floor with a napkin. Yuri apologized, but no attention was paid to him. Then the crown prince sadly continued to dine in complete silence, and it seemed that this was a usual thing for him. Daria's heart sank from such a thing. She watched her boy all day and could only say that Yuri was silent most of the time and did not smile at all. Then the mother noticed how her prince looked around, which he quickly took from the table and hid in his pocket so that the maids would not notice it. The girl was very surprised. She did not understand why he needed to hide the fruit. After dinner, Yuri ran to the garden. His mother followed him and pointed out that this was the place where she met him yesterday. When the boy sat down by the flower bed, he took out an apple from his pocket, and then a little puppy ran out of the flowers to him. It was Yuri who offered him the apple. Watching from behind the bushes, it now became clear to Daria what exactly her son had taken from the table and why. Yuri sat and stroked the puppy that was eating an apple, and then a beautiful smile shone on the boy's face. He told the puppy not to be afraid and to eat calmly, that no one would offend him. Suddenly, the puppy jumped into the prince's arms and began to lick him all over, and Yuri burst out laughing from the tickling. Watching this action, Daria was moved. It was the first time she had ever seen a boy laugh like that. It also meant that Yuri had a secret friend all this time. Thinking about the puppy, the girl suddenly came up with the idea of a bottle of milk. She quickly rushed to the kitchen, hoping that the puppy would like it. The girl did not even suspect that she was not the only one secretly watching Yuri. Someone else was watching him. But when Daria left, they quietly approached Yuri from behind. The boy looked around and horror appeared on his face. Behind her stood a displeased Miss Adelaide with her maids, and one of them was already giving the woman a trick. The puppy bared its teeth, and Yuri jumped up and, covering the animal with himself, began to ask the teacher not to touch the puppy, that it was all his fault. But Adelaide was ruthless. She ordered the maids to get rid of the flea, and they began to carry out the order. One of the maids held Yuri, and the other grabbed the puppy by the scruff of the neck. The boy shouted for them not to touch and let the animal go, but it was useless. Then Yuri broke free from the hands of the maid and rushed to the teacher in despair. He tearfully begged her not to do this. The crown prince held the woman by the dress and, sobbing, begged her to stop. Suddenly, a strong blow of the nagaika threw the boy from the feet of the indifferent teacher. Adelaide angrily looked at Yuri and only noted that he was dirty. She continued that he was the crown prince, and he should not have a single second that he could spend on something useless. For example, for games with this dirty and flea-ridden dog. The teacher reminded that she had already told him many times that all he should think about is how to become better for this country. And after her tirade, the woman said that the prince had been punished. Then she looked into Yuri's big red eyes and ordered him to quickly control himself. Gritting his teeth, the boy lowered his eyes and began to roll up his sleeves on one arm. Adelaide smiled with satisfaction. With a predatory smile, she swung her spear at Yuri. How suddenly there was a cry that ordered the woman to immediately take her hands away from the boy. Meanwhile, a large cavalry led by Emperor Alexander arrived at the palace. His ward was already waiting for His Majesty at the gate, a guy in a uniform with pink hair and green eyes. He saluted and congratulated His Majesty on his return, who had just ridden through the palace gates. Jumping off his horse, Alexander noted with relief that he had finally returned. Then the man immediately asked the commander if something had happened in the castle in his absence. The boy told what had happened and immediately told the emperor in his ear how things were going. After listening to the report, Alexander thought, and then noted that when the matter touches the door, it creates whatever it wants. And at this moment, at the other end of the palace, a strict and merciless teacher began to punish her student. But when the angry cry rang out, the bowl of milk fell on the paved path of the garden. Yuri opened his eyes wide in surprise when he realized that someone had covered him, and Adelaida even cursed with a raised nag. The boy was amazed to see that it was his mother who rushed to protect him and covered him with her body. Daria was furious and began to demand explanations from the teacher about what was happening here. But Adelaida mockingly noted that the invisible wife had appeared. And despite the empress's questions, she wondered if the girl had decided to ignore the words she had previously said. As here, one of the maids accompanying Adelaide bowed low to the empress and explained that they had noticed that the crown prince was behaving strangely, so they followed him. And it turned out that he was feeding a dirty puppy. Adelaide picked up the servant's story and drew the wife's attention to the fact that her unsupervised son was disobeying and behaving inappropriately for the crown prince. Yuri trembled with shame, and it hurt him to hear condemnation from adults. And then the teacher, with disdain in her voice, noted that it was probably due to the fact that the stupid blood of his mother began to awaken in the boy. Daria ignored what Adelaide said and asked where they took the poor puppy. With a smug smile, the woman replied that it was customary to get rid of dirty things immediately. That playing with that dirty puppy is a waste of time, therefore most likely he is already in the incinerator. Yuri was shocked to hear this. The empress cried out that it was too cruel, and Adelaide, poking at her with a stick, also shouted that it's not a girl to be angry at that. The woman screamed that His Majesty had put her in charge of all aspects of the crown prince's upbringing and education, so it was only natural that she tried to keep the boy away from all distractions and harmful factors. But as everything is like that, it did not behoove her Baroness to interfere in the affairs of the empire. And since the girl has already managed to get into the palace, then she should quietly roll like a mouse in oil. Daria was just about to answer something, when suddenly Yuri shouted loudly for the mother to stop. The Empress looked at her son in surprise, not understanding what had happened and why he was asking her to stop. Then Yuri, squeezing his little hands, asked for forgiveness and said that it was all his fault. And bitter tears again fell from his eyes. It hurt the girl to see her son in such a state. She approached the boy and tried to comfort him. Matinka said he did nothing wrong. Daria touched Yuri's shoulder and felt how he trembled. The mother's heart gave a sharp pain, and Adelaide did not calm down. She tapped her palm with a nut and said that their dear boy had done badly after all. Pointing at Yuri with a stick, the teacher said that the crown prince showed his playful hypocrisy. Because of this, the puppy died. All because of him. A new shock, like an electric current, hit Yuri again. He apologized once more, with blurred eyes that began to fill with tears. Adelaide sighed exasperatedly and said what a pity, because the crown prince should not shed tears over some dog under the fence. That woman was killed. In a creepy, menacing voice, the Empress ordered the teacher to close her mouth. Daria looked at Adelaide with crazy eyes and said that the real pity is to look at her. The woman, along with the maid, were stunned by such a look and the girl's defiant answer. Adelaide came to her senses and wanted to ask the girl what she had just said, but did not let her finish. The Empress said that despite the fact that they do not recognize her as the mother of this child, she will no longer tolerate such a rude and insolent attitude of Adelaide. Saying these words, Daria stood next to Yuri, touching his back. And the boy felt for the first time that someone was on his side. Adelaide herself was enraged by such insolence and just wanted to say something again, but the Empress again stopped her with a wave of her hand. The girl asked if the woman knew why the prince was crying, and then she explained that it was because he felt sorry for that puppy. And this only means that her dear son, after all the cruel treatment of Adelaide, still has a kind heart. The Empress concluded that even a child is stronger than a woman because she was able to save her heart, and she lost it somewhere in the pursuit of meaningless fame. Adelaide shrieked. What insolent words the girl spoke! It was so loud that Yuri covered his ears with his hands in fright, and Daria calmly noted that this was not all that she wanted to say. The girl said that all the letters Yuri wrote for her did not reach her hands. And why? Because someone ordered to hide these letters in a warehouse, so she is wondering who it could be. Hearing this, Yuri looked at his mother in surprise. Daria then firmly stated that it was none other than the tutor herself, Miss Adelaide. The woman and the maid burst out laughing. Adelaide asked sarcastically, "What is going on here? That the Baron's daughter has remembered her father's past and now blames all people for her problems until she has any evidence in her hands?" But the mocking woman did not notice how the Empress approached her and firmly grabbed her hand. The teacher was quite frightened. The girl sniffed Adelaide's wrist, and then she looked contentedly into the woman's eyes and said that now she understood why, when she read those letters, they smelled of the teacher's terrible perfume. Adelaide threw out her hand and cried out in shame that this was the first time in her life that someone had treated her with such blatant disrespect. She cried that her nephew was Mr. Claus himself, His Majesty, the Emperor. Then the woman began to threaten. Does the girl understand what he will do to her when he finds out about everything? The Empress silently looked wolfishly at Adelaide and pondered her threats. How suddenly a voice was heard saying that he had heard his name. Everyone present opened their mouths when they saw the Emperor accompanied by his butler. Adelaide was the first to recover from the shock and joyfully greeted His Majesty the Emperor. Alexander looked at his aunt without emotion and did not answer her. Daria and Yuri looked at the Emperor in surprise for a few more seconds. Yuri was especially impressed. Then the girl quickly stood in front of her son, ready to protect him. She thought that since His Majesty himself had appointed his aunt to be responsible for his son's upbringing, it was obvious that he should take her side. The Emperor asked, "What is going on here?" Adelaide hastened to inform His Majesty that she was most displeased to be accused of a crime she had not committed, and she added that, judging by everything, Her Majesty the Empress has a tendency to invent delusions. The woman also demonstratively approached the Emperor and, hugging him, emphasized that now she is seriously worried about the future of the imperial family. Memories of Yuri's birthday and those painful words of Adelaide that His Majesty the Emperor had already said that her role as a wife was over immediately appeared before Daria's eyes. The girl was preparing for the worst scenario of events. But suddenly, unexpectedly, sharply, angrily, and menacingly, the word, "Get out!" With a burning look, Alexander looked at Adelaide and once again angrily repeated that he had told her to remove her dirty hands from him. The woman was simply stunned to see how angry the emperor was and how he was talking to her. Daria and Yuri were also very surprised. They both looked at His Majesty in bewilderment. The shocked teacher barely dared to ask what Alexander meant. The emperor said that he had instructed his subordinates to conduct an investigation into her upbringing and educational methods. The woman shouted indignantly that she could not believe that he had done this, and His Majesty, glancing displeasedly at his aunt, continued that he was informed that during his absence in the palace in connection with the expedition, she nursed here whatever she wanted. The woman trembled with fear. She tried to justify that all she was thinking about was how to properly raise the crown prince. But the emperor wondered that apart from the fact that his son's body had traces of her beatings, was hiding his son's letters to his mother part of the educational process? The teacher answered that no. Then Alexander noted that he tried to respect the only closest relative of his late mother. But he overdid it with trust, and it almost led to irreversible consequences. Then His Majesty firmly declared that all the actions of the woman deserved the death penalty. Adelaide's legs buckled and she fell to the ground in shock. The teacher could not believe what she heard. Standing before Alexander on her knees, the horrified Adelaide began to desperately beg His Majesty for mercy. She was all trembling with fear and already lying on the ground, begged to forgive her for all her repeated rudeness. But the emperor did not answer. He simply turned and walked away. But Alexander did not have time to go far when Daria called out to him and asked His Majesty to wait. The emperor stopped and remarked that she is the empress and should be well aware that insulting the imperial family entails the most serious consequences. The girl replied that she was perfectly aware of it, and she explained to her husband that someone like that woman would too easily be sentenced to death, so the culprit must atone for her guilt by going to a place very far from here. That Adelaide must be deprived of her position, status, and all rights of aristocracy. In other words, death is an easier fate for her than atonement for her sins. At first, the emperor clearly answered no to Daria's proposed punishment, and then he looked at Yuri, who was still standing and looking at his father in surprise. Alexander thought. Then His Majesty said that he would think about the opinion of the empress. With these words, the man turned and left. Here Adelaide turned to Daria, who was still lying prostrate on the ground and trembling. The woman announced with a strained smile that she was pledging her allegiance to Empress Daria for a pardon. That girl interrupted her, saying that it was not for her sake, that she did so only for the sake of Yuri. The empress explained that she thinks that if the woman is executed, then Yuri will consider himself guilty for the rest of his life, although she herself does not think so. So Daria, with her head proudly raised, looked at the humiliated and fallen teacher for a few more minutes. Then the girl smiled widely and asked Adelaide if she knew the Candela region that was north of here. Horror appeared on the woman's face, and the empress said that there is a beautiful monastery there in which the most important importance is given to discipline. Adelaide bowed her head and answered that she knew. She thought to herself that this place was an ice prison, a place that the worst sinners fear to death. Then the empress announced that from tomorrow this terrible place would become her second native home for the woman. Then Daria took Yuri's hand and said that it was time for them to go too. The boy agreed, but still looked at the teacher for a few seconds, who was overcome with terror and despair. Yuri followed the empress. Realizing what had just happened, the little son tightly squeezed his mother's hand. Returning to the palace, Daria and his son stopped in one of the rooms to rest and talk. Mother stroked Yuri's head and apologized for having intervened too late and not being able to help with that cute puppy. The boy awkwardly turned his head and answered that it was okay. With sadness, Yuri thought that he did not understand why his mother was apologizing. After all, she is not really to blame in this situation, but he is. The puppy was killed because of him. Suddenly, someone's steps and a loud barking were heard from the corridor. Daria and Yuri looked at each other in surprise. There was a knock on the room and a subordinate of His Majesty appeared at the door. The boy, smiling sincerely with joy, informed Mr. Yuri that he had a present for the prince and handed the boy a cage in which the same puppy was sitting. Yuri jumped up from his seat with joy and shouted the puppy's name, Lulu. He kept asking, "Where did she come from?" Daria was also impressed by the appearance of the puppy. The boy bowed and explained that he was the one who had been ordered to follow the prince's tutor, so when he saw the prince's friend being taken to the incinerator, he had to intervene. Yuri looked at the boy in the uniform with enchanted eyes full of admiration and gratitude, and the boy said that he still had a message from His Majesty the Emperor. If the crown prince wants to keep the puppy, then Lulu can safely be on the palace grounds. Daria was also glad to see the puppy and the emperor's permission to leave it in the palace. She noted that this is great news. Yuri looked at his mother with an incredibly beautiful, happy, and radiant smile and answered that it was so. Then the boy sat next to the cage with Lulu and smiled happily. The emperor's ward recommended that before finally releasing the puppy, it is necessary to take it to a veterinarian for an examination. The boy then said that it was better to introduce himself late than never, and introduced himself that his name was Johann, and he was appointed colonel of the 5th Division of the Ilvarian Empire. With a broad smile, the colonel announced that it was time for him, and they would see each other later. The empress also smiled at Johann in response and thanked him. Then she was overcome with nostalgia. After all, in her previous life, everyone was absolutely indifferent to her, and she was always alone, even in a crowd of people, and Johann was the only one who did not stop greeting her and saying kind words, even when they haven't seen each other for a long time, since he— Here the empress asked if she could ask Johann for a favor. The guy replied that of course and said that she should ask for everything that comes to mind. He was as happy as a dog and faithfully waited for an order. The girl apologized to Johann about herself. She was sure that doing her service would bring him a lot of trouble. Then the empress beckoned the boy to her and began to whisper her request in his ear. The joyous smile immediately disappeared from Johann's face when he heard what exactly needed to be done, and he was thrown into a frenzy. Horror and tears appeared in the colonel's eyes when he listened to the empress's request to the end. A new sunny day has arrived. Yuri watched in fascination as the puppy Lulu was being bathed in a large basin in the middle of the palace garden. Although the puppy was very cute, it soon became obvious that it was still very curly and that the two maids had a hard time cleaning it. The boy also wanted to wash Lulu, but in his little head, the image of the teacher Adelaide constantly appeared, who said with disgust that he was dirty. Because of this, Yuri was very upset and felt embarrassed. He didn't know how to deal with this oppressive feeling. As the voice of the empress rang out, she told the maids that she would help them with the puppy. Yuri was very surprised at the arrival of his mother and the confidence with which she began to roll up her sleeves without hesitation. One of the maids worriedly explained to Her Majesty the Empress that they could not allow her to get her hands dirty. Daria looked at the woman in surprise. The girl thought that the suspension and exile of the head teacher seemed to have made itself felt, and she noticed that the other servants were trying to understand all of Adelaide's mistakes, and it seemed that they began to treat her with more respect. Then the Empress eagerly answered the maid that everything was fine. After all, it is not someone there, but a dear friend of Yuri. So the maid agreed with Her Majesty's judgment. With a smile on her face, Daria enthusiastically began to bathe the cute red-haired puppy Lulu. Then the Empress looked at her depressed son and asked if he wanted to join. Yuri wanted to object to her, but the mother said that since it was Lulu, everything was fine, and beckoned the boy with her hand. Yuri hesitated, and the red-haired puppy happily splashed in the water. It constantly twirled its tail and splashed foam around. Looking at such cuteness, the crown prince could not stand it and rushed to the wooden basin. The boy happily bathed his friend Lulu and a happy smile lit up his face. Then the Empress said that now they must rinse the puppy with water. Then Yuri warned Lulu that now it would be necessary to be patient. After that, Daria and his son poured water over the puppy. And what was the surprise of everyone around when they saw a washed Lulu? They were amazed. After all, instead of a small red-haired puppy, now in front of them sat a small purebred dog with brown and white fur. Yuri began to hug Lulu, and Daria and the maids said in one voice that they could not even think that such a cute little face was hiding behind this dirt. The crown prince was extremely happy. He continued to smile without letting go of Lulu's hand. Meanwhile, in the emperor's office, His Majesty was working on documents, and Johann was looking at the window, from which he could see everything that was happening there. The colonel saw how they bathed the puppy, and then a happy Yuri played with it. The boy told the emperor that the puppy was simply too dirty, and after washing it, turned out to be a completely different dog. Without breaking away from his work, Alexander expressed his surprise in an indifferent voice. Then Johann remarked that if His Majesty had not entrusted him to look after Miss Adelaide, this charming dog would have long since turned into a pile of bones. And Johann began to brag, noting that it was a pity that the emperor did not see how he had turned it around. It was so impressive that you can organize a whole performance. The whole inspired and shining guy declared that he is ready to take over the entire organization of the performance. Alexander just sighed and told the colonel not to get carried away. Johann's ardor disappeared and he slumped. Then the boy inquired whether His Majesty had made up what punishment Miss Adelaide would suffer. The man replied that he had thought of it. He would send the aunt to a monastery in the Candela region, which is to the north of here. The colonel was thrown into a frenzy. He noted with horror that it was better to be executed than to be sent to this terrible place. Johann said that he still thought it was too cruel to do this to her and asked how His Majesty had come to such a decision. The emperor replied that it was not he, but the empress. What exactly did she organize to send the tutor there? The guy jumped up and shouted in a daze about another thing so harsh. Alexander looked menacingly at the colonel and asked, "What does one more thing mean?" Johann understood that he had been tricked and admitted that Her Majesty had ordered him to do something. The empress asked the boy to tell His Majesty to return all decision-making powers, including the education department, to the palace and the empress's secretariat. Alexander was in shock. He sharply replied to Johann that it was not possible. After all, transferring the rights to the palace to the empress also means entrusting her with the upbringing of the crown prince. His Highness in a menacing voice asked the colonel if he was sure that the straggler family would not take advantage of the opportunity and attack Yuri at a convenient opportunity, that in this way they could expose him to danger. Slamming his fist on the table, Alexander angrily said that he could not allow them to succeed and their son to inherit the throne. Johann understood the emperor's feelings and concerns, and Alexander, writing something on a piece of paper. And then, in a completely calm voice, he added that he still trusted the empress's decision and handed the colonel a letter with permission. Johann was in shock. He looks at the emperor in confusion and says that of course he will hand over everything. But why is he doing this? But His Majesty did not explain anything. He got up from the table and silently left the office. Perplexed, Johann remained standing with the permit in his hands. Later, Empress Daria rested in her chambers after such an active morning. She thought about the fact that when they were completely covered in foam, Yuri giggled so much, and that way he was more like a child. She was already glad that Lulu was returned to them. Daria even laughed, remembering this happy moment. But suddenly, the smile disappeared from her face. The sad expression of an adult Yuri from a past life appeared before the girl's eyes, his despair and bitter tears. She remembered that in his past life, Yuri got into the same situation and lost Lulu. With sadness, Daria thought, what right did she have to enjoy life when her son had to suffer so much? For 15 years until her death, she never noticed Yuri's suffering and accordingly could not do anything about his strict growing up. That her non-interference, her desire not to open her eyes and understand the situation, and now she will have to bear responsibility for this mortal sin for the rest of her life. The girl understood that she could not change the past, nor could she erase all the suffering that Yuri had to go through alone. Daria also believed that no matter how much she compensated, she would never be able to get rid of the feeling that whatever she did, no matter when, would not be enough. But she will never make him sad again. Suddenly, the Empress's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Daria was surprised. Who could it be? She asked, "Who is there?" From the corridor came the voice of Emma's servant, who asked Her Majesty's permission to enter. Daria allowed. When Emma entered, Daria saw the crown prince peering curiously from behind her skirt. The girl was very happy to see that Yuri visited her for the first time and congratulated him. Then the mother asked what had happened, if he had already come all this way. Yuri was very embarrassed. He was embarrassed and, clinging more and more to the maid, answered that he wanted to tell his mother something. The boy stood still and did not dare to speak to his mother. He was very worried. Daria smiled and, bending over to her son, asked what he wanted to talk to her about. Then Yuri said that the day before, after his mother approached him, he immediately ran away. He is very sorry for that. And despite that incident, the mother still came alone and helped them bathe Lulu. Yuri lowered his eyes and was shaking. He said that he should have apologized earlier and supported his mother, so he apologizes. He is very sorry. Daria went down to her son and gently said that everything was fine. Smiling, she said that it seems to her that he then behaved like that for a reason. And she remarked that it must have been because of Lulu, wasn't it? That then the boy was worried that no one would find Lulu, that he was very afraid for the puppy. The girl thought to herself that she was still sure that Yuri tried to escape in any way to protect Lulu so that no one would find him. Yuri was moved by the fact that his mother understood everything, that she did not scold him, but on the contrary, supported him again. Then the boy gathered courage and announced that he wanted to add something else. Mother asked what exactly, and Yuri asked if they could continue the conversation about the flowers they talked about last time. And wouldn't Mother like to look at them? Daria was extremely happy to hear such an offer from her son. She gladly agreed and said that now she would never leave him alone, that they will always do everything together and will not leave each other alone. With these words, the Empress took the prince's little finger with her little finger and added that it was a promise. About herself, Daria thought that the boy had many heavy responsibilities and he had to carry them on his small shoulders alone. Therefore, she hopes that she will be able to lighten the burden on his heart and will do everything necessary for this. Then Maid Emma said that Mr. Uri still wanted to show Her Majesty something and pointed to the small purse hanging on the shoulders of the Crown Prince. Yuri remembered that he really wanted to show something and began rummaging in his bag. In her mind, Daria noted that he was so cute, but suddenly the boy's face became very sad and he hunched over. The prince again stood next to the maid and took her by the skirt, squeezing it. Emma did not immediately understand what had happened, but Daria understood. She gently took her son by the face, looked into his eyes and said that he could tell her anything he wanted. And the mother began to give examples of the conversation, about how Lulu was full of energy again and they had a wonderful walk, or about how he had a terrible dream. Then she will hug him and listen to what the horror was about, and even about how beautiful the sky is today. Even if nothing special happened, but he wants to share something. She is always ready to listen to him, about anything. After all, she just likes to hear his voice. Yuri was impressed by his mother's words, and she asked him not to think that she may not be interested or that she does not have time for him. While his mother held Yuri's hands, he lowered his eyes and thought that he did not know this as a new feeling. Then the boy said that he thought it was time for him to go back. Seeing the reaction of the Crown Prince, Emma was surprised and worried because that was not all. Yuri approached the maid, and Emma looked at the Empress, waiting for her instructions. But Daria, smiling, just waved after her son. She said everything was fine, and if Yuri wants to talk about something, he can come at any time, or give her a sign and she will come by herself. When the Crown Prince left the Empress's chambers, Daria became worried. She assumed that perhaps the boy meant the Crown Festival by saying, "It's time to come back." Festival of the Crown is when on the 6th birthday, parents give the Crown Prince a sword and shield, symbols of trust and love. This ceremony means that the emperor recognizes the Crown Prince as the full heir to the empire. When Emma, leaving the Empress's room, paused to bow to Her Majesty, Daria called out to her. The girl asked the maid to come to her after she takes Yuri, that something needs to be discussed. Emma replied that she would be back soon. Later, a sad Yuri was sitting on the bed in his room, and in front of him was a letter addressed to the Empress. The boy wrote to his mother that he had a dance lesson today. He was so interested that he wanted to dance with her. So he will practice asking her to the dance after the Crown Festival. Yuri thought about the fact that his mother is the Empress, and the Empress has her own affairs and obligations. That's why she was willing to listen to him. He should not forget and get carried away, and besides. And then Yuri remembered an unpleasant and creepy scene. There was a man in it, next to whom stood a boy not much older than him. Seeing Yuri with contempt in his eyes, this boy mockingly asked if this was the same Crown Prince. Yuri was frightened by this memory and was trembling. Here, Lulu jumped onto the Crown Prince's bed and also crouched down, seeing a sad owner. Then Yuri took the dog in his hands. Hugging him, the boy shared his feelings with his friend and said that he did not want to disappoint anyone. A little later, as promised, Emma's maid came to Her Majesty the Empress. Daria was sitting on the sofa with some kind of box. Opening the box, the girl told the maid that she wanted to make a gift for Yuri. In the casket lay an extremely beautiful ornament, a necklace with precious stones. The Empress explained that she wanted Emma to go to the city and exchange this necklace for cash. The maid was quite surprised and asked if Her Majesty really wanted her to sell this thing. The Empress confirmed. Daria understood Emma's surprise because it was a gift for the first month of their marriage to the emperor. The girl recalled how once at dinner Alexander handed her this necklace. She was surprised and asked if she could really keep such a precious thing, to which the emperor replied that if she didn't like it, she could throw it away. At that moment, Daria was very happy because this gift was the first that her husband made. It literally meant that he officially recognized her as his wife. Emma questioned Her Majesty once again. Was she sure of her decision? The Empress replied that she was sure. She explained that the Empress's palace rights have not yet been officially recognized, and she does not have access to the treasury. In addition, she has a limited budget now, and there is not enough money for a gift, so it does not make sense to keep things at home that she hardly ever uses. About herself, Daria noted that before looking at this thing, she found inspiration in it and felt herself worthy of the role of Empress. But now she does not need to rely on external support because she is able to move forward independently. The maid remarked that she thought that a considerable sum of money would be obtained from this. And then Emma saw the Empress handing her another box of jewelry, and she didn't understand why. And the girl explained that it was a gift for her. Emma was stunned by the words of Her Majesty and could not understand how this was a gift for her. The Empress confirmed that it was for her. She explained that she had paid attention to Yuri just recently, and it seemed to her that he felt some kind of attachment to the maid, maybe even protection, that she felt such relief when she knew that there was someone with him all this time who could take care of him. That's why she thought that she should somehow thank Emma. Then the Empress remarked that Yuri seemed to like flowers very much, and since out of all the maids, he feels the greatest attachment to Emma then. Taking out a small brooch in the form of a flower from the box, Her Majesty attached it to the maid's dress and added that she was sure that it would be even more pleasant for Yuri to look at Emma this way. As the Empress attached the ornament to the dress, Emma thought that she was afraid of that woman's power, and because of that, she was unable to fully protect Daria's child. Reflecting on the past, the maid worried if the Empress could forgive her for that. Then, after attaching the ornament, Daria turned to Emma and said that she counted on her continued support. Then the maid, putting her hand on her heart, solemnly declared that she, Emma, would pledge herself with all her heart to serve Her Majesty the Empress. A little later, Emma served tea to Her Majesty and asked, what exactly did she want to present to Yuri? Daria laughed happily and inspiredly told that she wanted to give him a shield. A few days later, 2 merchants arrived at the Empress's palace. One was a bald man with a beard, the other was still quite a boy. Emma was also present at the meeting. The older man was amazed that Her Majesty wanted to purchase a shield for His Highness the Crown Prince. He noted that shields were not available at all recently, and it was also quite difficult to get them. The Empress asked if this meant that the merchant did not have a suitable shield. The man objected and said that everything would be found for the Crown Prince on an important day. Then he took out of the box a small dummy shield with monograms and coats of arms and offered it to the Empress. Wouldn't this suit her for the Crown Festival? Seeing this, Emma got angry. After all, it was only a fake, an imitation of a real shield. She assumed that this merchant might be taking the imperial family lightly. The man apologized and noted that he was the last one left. There were no others. The Empress carefully looked at the proposed option and thought. Then she turned to the young merchant and asked what shields he had. The boy shuddered. He was very worried, so he narrowed his eyes and answered Her Majesty that he was very sorry. They were unable to prepare a shield that would be suitable for His Highness the Crown Prince. Then the Empress pointed with a fan at the senior merchant and said that he could go. The man didn't immediately realize that he was being pointed at, not the boy, until Emma took hold of him to escort him out. Daria then thanked the bald merchant for the fact that they had been carefully selecting goods for the imperial household all this time. But with today's incident, she was afraid that they would never meet again. When Emma took the man out into the corridor, he started screaming indignantly, not understanding what was happening. What does this mean? That the Empress didn't even ask how much the shield cost? Then the merchant chirped angrily and noted that the Emperor was unlucky to marry such a young baroness. And then he impudently turned to Emma and said that he perfectly understood how difficult it was for her, and reaching out to the maid with his hand, he lustily asked if she wanted to go somewhere in the evening. But the next moment, the man flew over the girl's shoulder and fell to the floor. He shouted angrily, "What does she do?" And Emma asked, "Didn't he hear what the Empress said?" The merchant did not understand what he was talking about. and the girl explained that although all this time he was one of the main merchants of the imperial family, Her Majesty recognized him as useless, since he is only capable of offering goods of dubious quality. The man was so upset that he was recognized as useless, and in the end, closing the door in front of her husband, Emma shouted angrily that he would never again be able to show his ugly and disgusting head in front of the beautiful empress. Then she slammed the door hard. Returning to the empress, Emma bowed her head and began to apologize to Her Majesty because it was she who invited that merchant to the palace. But while the maid was gone, Daria talked with the young merchant. Then she approached Emma and asked her to raise her head. Looking up, Emma was frightened because a toy jumped out at her, which was held on a spring and was attached to a box, which, in turn, was held in the hands of the empress. Bewildered and frightened, Emma opened her eyes to Her Majesty, who stood there laughing. Looking at the various items and knickknacks the young merchant had brought with him, the empress said that thanks to Emma, she now had a wide choice among all these beautiful gifts, so why should she be the one to punish her? Emma wanted to object, but Daria interrupted. She said that she had already told the maid that she wanted to choose a present, and she did a great job of fulfilling her request. And she will prepare the shield for the crown festival elsewhere, so don't worry about it. Here the merchant intervened in the conversation. He was sorry to report this, but Duke Straggler had bought up all the shields and all the swords in the entire country right before the crown festival. The boy stated that he was afraid it was for this reason that Her Majesty would find it difficult to find a suitable shield and sword for His Highness the Crown Prince. Daria thought about Duke Straggler's family. The Duke was a cousin of Emperor Alexander. His main goal was to displace Yuri and by any means deprive him of the right to inherit the throne, and all in order to make his son the next emperor. The reason for her marriage to the emperor was to prevent the stragglers from placing their offspring on the throne. It was a loveless marriage, just to produce an heir. The empress hastened to reassure the merchant and happily said that there was no need to worry about the shield, that she already had a plan, but thanked him for telling everything. The boy bowed. Then the empress turned to Emma again and asked if she could trust her to deliver this letter to the city, and as soon as possible. The maid was surprised at such a request, but replied that she would do everything as ordered. Then Daria turned to the merchant and asked if he could deliver these 2 types of fabric and buttons by next week, and also cotton. And Emma kept looking at the empress and wondered why Her Majesty was ordering all this. At first the empress wanted to answer, but changed her mind. She didn't say anything, but just smiled broadly and joyfully. A little later, Johann, all excited and confused, joyfully shouted about the birthday party. Emma snapped at him and whispered to the colonel that there was no need to shout like that. The guy quickly covered himself. And this is not surprising, because Yuri was playing with Lulu nearby in the garden. They both stood closer to the palace walls and watched over the crown prince. Emma explained that Her Majesty, the Empress, wanted to help His Highness Yuri relax a bit and relieve some tension before the crown festival. That she wants Yuri to know that his birthday is the happiest day of the year. And Emma added that she perfectly understood Her Highness. Johann thought about something. Then the colonel told with delight that when he was a child, his parents prepared such a huge pudding for his birthday. And this despite the fact that the ingredients for it are very expensive. The boy said that he will remember these wonderful moments for the rest of his life. Emma gave the colonel a cold look and said that she was happy for him, but they wouldn't do that. Johann took the hint and apologized. Then the boy once again looked at the joyful Yuri playing with Lulu and remarked that Her Majesty the Empress was trying very hard for His Highness the Crown Prince. Emma agreed with him. Looking at the colonel, Emma thought to herself that he understood everything surprisingly easily. And then the maid made a serious expression and asked Johann whether he agreed to cooperate or not. The colonel felt a little embarrassed. He thought that it would be inappropriate to hand over the signed document right now. Johann giggled. And then, with a wide, bright smile, he replied that he was in favor. And he emphasized that they will do everything to make this birthday the best. Days passed, and preparations for the birthday were in full swing. The Empress, with the help of her maids and Colonel Johann, decorated the hall with ribbons, paper flowers, and balloons. The birthday was getting closer, even the cake was ready, and Daria kept thinking about the fact that Yuri did not smile at all at the previous Corona festivals. But this time she wants to convey her words to him, to tell him that she was so glad that she had such a wonderful son. After all the preparations, the senior maid asked Emma, When was the last time there was so much commotion in the Empress's palace? The girl answered that probably on the day when His Highness Yuri was born. Unexpectedly, someone slapped the maids on the shoulders. Was it the joyful Empress who asked what they were talking about? With happiness on her face, the girl said that now every year there will be such a commotion in her palace as well. After all, this is an important day that happens only once a year. Meanwhile, the unsuspecting Yuri sat in his room at the table and studied. Suddenly, the boy heard footsteps coming from the corridor and became agitated. He thought it must be a teacher. When the door to the room opened, Yuri narrowed his eyes and apologized to the teacher. He said that he would speed up now and complete the task by the appointed time. Just then, the boy heard a rather familiar male voice which kindly greeted him. Yuri was more than surprised when he saw Johann, and the colonel asked, "Isn't it time for you to finish your classes for today?" Yuri looked at the boy in confusion. Johann then cleared his throat and stated in a formal tone that he had been ordered to bring the crown prince to one place on an important matter. And then Johann picked up Yuri and, putting him on his shoulders loudly, announced that he was the colonel of the 5th Corps of the Ilvarian Imperial Army, Johann Carasini. Was the boy stunned and did not understand what was happening? And Johann said that he would carry him and advised him to hold on tight. And at full sail, the colonel rushed through the corridors of the palace with the crown prince on his shoulders. After a few minutes, worried Emma looked at the awkward situation that had developed and tried to quickly find a way out. Yuri was standing in the middle of the hall with a holiday cap on his head and had a depressed, not at all happy look. The Empress sat nearby, looked at her son, and did not know what to say. She didn't understand why the atmosphere at the party suddenly became so cheerless. It all started when Johann brought the bewildered crown prince to the hall. The Empress and her maidservants met him with joyful smiles and greeted him. And then they started to pop firecrackers and all together loudly congratulate Yuri on his birthday. The boy was shocked. Then Johann quickly seated the crown prince at the table, and the maid quickly put a festive cap on his head. Yuri was amazed that they were all involved in the surprise. Then Emma cleared her throat and, begging His Highness, picked up a large lamb standing in front of him. Under it was a large cake decorated with strawberries and a candle in the shape of the number 6. Yuri was happy when he saw the festive cake, and Johann also encouraged the boy. Then the Empress leaned over to her son and with a joyful smile told him to make a wish. Yuri took in a full lungful of air and blew out the candle with all his might. Everyone around joyfully began to greet the boy. Emma revealed that she was the one making the cake for Mr. and noted that she had tried very hard. The senior maid said that she had prepared a lot of trinkets for Mr. Yuri that he could play with. And Johann presented a bouquet of origami flowers and said that he made a bouquet for the crown prince that will stay with him for the rest of his life. Yuri was pleasantly surprised by how everyone present tried to do something for him. Then the boy was called by the Empress, who was crouching next to him and smiling joyfully. Full of happiness, with a big smile, she loudly congratulated her son on his 6th birthday. It was at this moment that Yuri lowered his eyes and crouched down. He just stood and was silent. Daria was confused. An excited Emma watched this incomprehensible scene, and the colonel and the senior maid looked at each other. Then a worried Emma rushed to His Highness, and let's ask what was wrong. Was the cream on the cake stale? Then an alarmed Johann joined in, asking if he had somehow injured the prince while carrying him here. Yuri hastened to calm them down and answered that everything was not right at all. With sadness in his voice, Yuri explained that he was simply celebrating his birthday for the first time in his life. And also, he had to break away from his studies today, and he did not get the maximum score for the water test. He is trying to practice fencing, but he is still not very good at it. Therefore, to celebrate his birthday now, for him it is an unacceptable luxury. The Empress calmly and attentively listened to her son and turned to him kindly again. She took out a small toy in the shape of a blue penguin and said that he only got one question wrong, and that was a great result. Daria showed her son a soft toy. Yuri looked at her in fascination and asked if it was Mr. Penguin. The mother confirmed and replied that everything is exactly like that. The boy wanted to object, but she cut him off. The Empress said that penguins take very good care of their families and friends. And the people gathered here are people who will worry about him like this. They worry about their family. Yuri listened carefully to his mother and imagined a family of penguins. He was beginning to realize what she was trying to tell him. Then the Empress wished Yuri to live a happy life with people whom he considers close. Daria said that she made this penguin in the hope that the boy would have these wonderful thoughts. And the mother asked if her son would accept her gift. Yuri stretched out his hands and took the toy. He trembled but plucked up courage and said that it was now his treasure. A happy and joyful smile returned to the boy's face. Hugging the toy tightly, Yuri thanked his mother for making it for him. The Empress gently hugged her son and stroked his head. And he said that he wanted today not to end. Then Daria let the boy go and added that penguins are also very hard-working. The Crown Prince nodded his head and replied that he would try even harder. Here Emma intervened in the conversation. She enthusiastically noted that Mr. Yuri works more conscientiously than anyone else. Then Johann joined in and noted that everything was correct, that the Crown Prince works even harder than a worker of his type. Yuri denied that this was not true at all. The Empress objected to the boy. She said that he really works very hard every day, and this means that this penguin is Yuri's hard-working friend. Yuri once again quietly said the friend, listening to his mother's words. Daria, Emma, and Johann were happy to help the Crown Prince figure it all out. Then the Empress urged everyone to continue the celebration. So the birthday continued. Yuri tasted the cake and said that it was very tasty. Emma was very happy and touched. After the cake, they all started playing different board games together, where the birthday boy was the winner. Yuri was also very frightened when the Empress pushed him a box from which a scary toy jumped out. And the celebration ended with the sweet sleep of the Crown Prince, who, already in his bed and hugging a toy penguin, muttered to himself that he wanted another piece of cake. Smiling, Daria quietly covered her son with a blanket, although she slightly woke up Lulu, who also settled on the Crown Prince's bed. The girl wished the boy sweet dreams and quietly left the room. Closing the door behind her, she accidentally caught a bandaged finger. Daria looked at her finger and remembered that she had pricked herself while sewing the penguin. The girl walked through the corridors of the palace on her way back to her room and reflected that it had been a long time since she had last picked up a needle, and she stabbed herself for the last time then. It was the 3rd month of her and Alexander's marriage. During one dinner, the man asked if she was doing anything today. Daria answered that she was busy. In the morning, she was trained in foreign languages, and in the afternoon, court training in embroidery. The emperor replied indifferently, "That's how." The girl said about herself that they meet once a month, and he asks the same questions and always answers the same. Holding an embroidered handkerchief under the table, Daria decided that today she would be the first to take a step forward in their relationship. But as soon as the girl thought about it, the emperor got up from the table and said that he was going back to his office. The embarrassed empress jumped up and, grabbing His Majesty's hand, asked him to wait a little. Alexander looked at his wife in surprise. Daria asked if the emperor remembered that the other day he praised her embroidery work. Then the girl handed the man an embroidered handkerchief and said that she had done it in today's lesson, thinking of His Majesty, and asked to accept the gift. But in response, Daria heard that he would not take it from her. In an exasperated voice, the emperor told her to put out of her mind any thoughts of making something for him with her own hands. He noted that this is a waste of time, of which she has so little. Therefore, it is better to spend time on something more useful. After these words, the emperor simply left. Deep love, that's what the handkerchief meant. At that moment, Daria thought that it could not be that His Majesty did not know the meaning when a wife gives her husband a handkerchief embroidered with her own hands. With deep sadness on her face, the girl said, "What is the point of their joint dinners?" It is from that day that the girl avoids using needles one more time. Looking at her finger again, she said that as a result, she still took up the needle and threads to make a toy for Yuri. And then Daria noticed the emperor, who was standing in the corridor near the door of her rooms. The girl crouched down. She thought that now was not a good time to see his face or cross paths with him at all. Alexander also noticed the empress, but when he looked at her more carefully, he suddenly frowned and his eyes became round. He quickly began to approach the girl. She felt sick and did not understand what happened. But approaching Daria, the emperor suddenly picked her up like a feather in his arms. The girl shouted indignantly, "Why is he all of a sudden?" And Alexander just as unexpectedly leaned his forehead against hers. Daria was even more confused. Finally, the empress spoke and noted that she had a fever. Then the girl herself put her hand to her forehead to check if it was really so. Daria thought to herself that His Majesty was one of those who did not care about such things. Meanwhile, Alexander carried the empress into the room and laid her on the bed. Her Majesty really looked unimportant and blushed all over. The emperor asked what she was doing all this time, and by his face you could tell that the man was very dissatisfied and angry. Here the girl realized that it was due to the fact that there were only a few days left before the Corona festival, and she collapsed with a fever, and it was not in time. Later, medicines and tea were brought to the Empress's chambers. Sitting on the bed, Daria explained to His Majesty that her finger was bandaged because she had pricked herself while practicing sewing, and since it fell at night, she was so excited that she did not sleep properly. The Emperor asked for sewing. He asked if she had started wasting her time on such useless things again. Daria did not understand why he was telling her this again, but the girl gathered herself. She casually and calmly answered that not to useless things, that today was her son's birthday. A slight shock appeared on His Majesty's face. He had nothing to answer. The Empress became interested. For Alexander, the memory of how Yuri celebrated his birthday for the first time in his life is also considered a waste of time. After putting away the medicine, Daria told the Emperor that she would be cured by the Crown Festival, and she apologized for the inconvenience caused. His Majesty looked again at the Empress and remained silent. Daria still could not understand what was wrong again. Suddenly, the Emperor got up from his chair, which frightened the girl, and silently went to the exit. After him, the Empress said that she thought he wanted to discuss something else with her, to which Alexander replied yes, that they are going to change the date of the festival. But Daria sharply said no. She firmly stated that the day of the festival will be held according to the schedule. Alexander looked at her and asked, "The decision to return the rights to the Empress's palace, has she already read the answer?" The girl was surprised and asked what the answer was, and the Emperor explained that he asked Johann to hand it over. Daria remembered how at the party, right before the end of the celebration, a joyful Johann came up to her and simply congratulated her, and then dozed off. Alexander then noted that the most important thing was that he had to convey it in an appropriate way. The man said he didn't know if she had been told or not, but he had signed a permit to return the palace rights to the Empress. Daria was surprised, and then menacingly added that at the same time he will continue to decide who will be responsible for the education of the Crown Prince, and he eerily noted that he hoped the Empress had no objections. Darius was frightened by such a threatening mood of the Emperor. With trembling hands, the girl dared to answer His Majesty that she also wanted to participate in the upbringing of her son. And she reminded the Emperor, did he not forget what happened when he transferred all the powers to Miss Adelaide? Then Alexander replied that maybe she wants it, maybe he even understands it, but will it be possible to trust the tutor she has chosen? What are the odds that he happens to be an assassin sent by Duke Straggler's family? And besides, if she is the one who takes control of the education of the Crown Prince, all the ill wishers who only want terrible changes in the system of their country will rise against her. Moreover, she is a young girl inexperienced in politics, so she is unlikely to be able to compete with them. Daria had nothing to say. She understood where Alexander was going, because Duke Straggler still planned to make his son the heir to the throne, and if she is responsible for Yuri's education, they will definitely use this opportunity to get rid of him. Nevertheless, in his previous life, Yuri was perfectly able to establish himself as the next emperor. This became possible only because the presence of Emperor Alexander was a restraining factor. And if the right to education goes to her, then everyone will be sure that His Majesty is simply letting Yuri go, as if he is rejecting him. Daria was worried that everything could happen again. After all, it was impossible to reject the possibility that Yuri would be treated badly. This thought hurt the girl, and she began to tremble all over. The Emperor looked at Daria for a few more minutes, and then declared that this was all he wanted to discuss with her today. The girl angrily exclaimed, "Why?" And she noted that, in general, she has not yet given her final answer about his decision. And with a burning look, read from the temperature, the Empress looked at her husband. Alexander felt uneasy at such a look from the girl. He tried to explain that he was trying to take stock now that she had a fever because she had overexerted herself today, and asked, what else does she want to tell him? Then Daria firmly stated that she wants to decide who will be responsible for the education of the Crown Prince, and she won't give up until she gets permission. Hearing the words of the Empress, Alexander silently turned around and wanted to leave. And Daria told him after him that lately it seems to her that he, His Majesty, looks at Yuri only from the point of view of the future emperor and not of his son. The man stopped abruptly and asked in a stern voice what she meant by this. And the girl wondered if, at least once, he looked at Yuri, not as a future emperor, but as a son. Did you look at him through the eyes of your father? Alexander coldly replied that Crown Prince Yuri is the next emperor who will rule this country. Therefore, he does not want to raise a weak-willed person from a boy who will show everyone his weaknesses. After listening to His Majesty's answer, Daria sadly concluded that, in other words, he married her for the sake of politics and is raising Yuri only for the country. After hearing the Empress's conclusions, Alexander clenched his fists and said that it was enough for today and left the room. Daria, upset and tired, said about herself that His Majesty did not even deny it. That for the Emperor Yuri, her sweet and precious son, is only a means to protect the country. There is absolutely no love in their marriage, and her only role is the birth of an heir and nothing more than that. Yes, she had known about it from the beginning, but nevertheless, for some reason, she still felt so bitter about it. Later, returning to his room, His Majesty took a bath and sat on the couch. On the table in front of him was a family photo in which he, Daria, and Yuri were depicted. Alexander held in his hands a small medallion, in the middle of which was the same photograph, only smaller in size.